Good evening, everyone. İyi akşamlar, and good morning, David. This is our 8th webinar. Thank you for joining us. It's very early where you're at the moment, and thank you for accepting our webinar to be with us on this very important topic. This is our 8th International Human Rights Mechanisms webinar. And for those of you who have participated in our previous webinars, this will be a repetition, sorry for that. But for the first timers, let me introduce myself and Etkiniz and our guest for today's webinar. My name is Arkadaş-Thibert'in. I'm Human Rights Monitoring and Advocacy Key Expert of the EU, Etkiniz EU program. It's a relatively new and innovative EU support program for civil society organizations in Turkey. It promotes accountability of human rights duty bearers and provides support for civil society organizations for monitoring compliance of Turkey's human rights obligations within the international human rights framework, mainly the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Etkiniz program strives to help civil society organizations in Turkey to increase their access and influence to European and international human rights frameworks and mechanisms. So we're here as a team. Our exceptional communications experts are here, Pınar and Fred. Our interpreters are here, Işıl and Deniz, and our sign language interpreter, Pelin, is here as well. Thank you. Well, in recent years, we have witnessed an increase in human rights violations of the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment in Turkey. Lack of robust policies to protect ecosystems, seas, rivers, forests. Also, mining companies and other extractive industries acting through legal loopholes or government protection sometimes, destroying forests and ecosystems. And poison marshlands and other water resources. There are also insufficient measures to protect forests from wildfires during summer months, intimidation of environmental human rights defenders. These are just a few examples of what we've witnessed in Turkey for the last couple of years. Although civil society organizations fight against all these domestically, sometimes we do not know much about one of the most important international mechanisms in the UN. Therefore, today, we're going to talk about the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment and the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, and healthy and sustainable environment. Our speaker is the UN Special Rapporteur himself, Professor David Boyd. He's an associate professor of law, policy and sustainability at the University of British Columbia. He has a PhD in resource management and environmental studies from University of British Columbia, a law degree from University of Toronto, and a business degree from the University of Alberta. His career has included serving as the executive director of EcoJustice. So he's also coming from an NGO background as well, appearing before the Supreme Court of Canada and working as a special advisor on sustainability for the Canadian Prime Minister, Paul Martin. So the floor is yours, David.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. And it's a real pleasure to be joining you today. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Pinar, for your technical work. And thank you to the interpreters for your invaluable services as well. I'm going to start out today and provide a kind of a quick overview of the UN human rights system, because there are multiple points of access for civil society. And I think it's important for everybody to have the opportunity to take advantage of those different types of mechanisms. And I'm going to share a few slides here as well, just to run through. And I'm joining you today from the west coast of Canada, where it's the sun has just come up and it's a beautiful day. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us on a Friday evening in Turkey. Of course, the modern human rights system began with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a political declaration which was then translated over the coming decades into a number of legally binding international treaties. There are 9 of these international human rights treaties, and some of them have direct application in the environmental context. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I would say, are the most important of those 9. But there's a institution called the treaty body that oversees the implementation of each of these 9 treaties. And there are some opportunities to bring environmental cases before these committees, which I'll talk about. Just to reiterate the kind of basic human rights obligations that states have for all human rights, and there are 3 of them: to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights. Respect means that the government must refrain from taking actions that violate our human rights. Protect means that governments must bring in legislation, regulations, and have institutions to protect our rights from violations by third parties, especially businesses. And finally, fulfilling human rights means that states themselves must take positive steps, such as building infrastructure for safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, and waste management. I mentioned the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, which includes things like the right to life, which is obviously affected by severe environmental degradation, climate change. And there is a protocol under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which allows individuals to bring complaints to the UN Human Rights Committee. And Turkey has ratified this first optional protocol, which means that Turkish citizens can bring cases to the Human Rights Committee, arguing that their rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been violated. And we're beginning to see cases about climate change and the environment coming to the Human Rights Committee. So I'm currently involved in a case that's been brought by a group of indigenous people who live off the coast of Australia, who are arguing that the government of Australia, by failing to take adequate climate action, both in terms of reducing emissions and preparing for the inevitable impacts of climate change, is violating their rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that case should actually be decided in the coming months by the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee also has published a very influential general comment on the right to life, which talks about how environmental degradation and climate change are some of the most important threats to the right to life of both present and future generations. And this general comment on the right to life is really an important document because it is beginning this process of unifying human rights law and environmental law, which for a long time have been seen as separate categories of law. And they each have strengths and weaknesses. But when you bring human rights law and environmental law together, you actually have a very strong and holistic approach to these problems. The second international covenant of great importance is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, rights such as the right to food, the right to health, both of which obviously are threatened by environmental degradation. And again, there is an optional protocol which establishes a procedure to accept individual complaints. However, Turkey has not ratified the optional protocol under this covenant, and that is something that I would encourage civil society in Turkey to urge the government to ratify this optional protocol so that cases can be brought. And as I said, there is a committee on the economic, social, and cultural rights, which can review communications, but only from individuals in countries that have ratified that optional protocol. The third global treaty I'll talk about just briefly is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Again, Turkey is a party to this Human Rights Convention, and Turkey has ratified the optional protocol under this. And so this is really critical because obviously children are one of the most vulnerable groups to climate change, to pollution, to the loss of biodiversity. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I should say that none of these conventions actually include the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The Convention on the Rights of the Child comes closest because in Article 24, which is about the children's right to health, it does talk about the importance of clean drinking water and taking into consideration the risks and the dangers of environmental pollution. And there just recently was a very important case brought to the Committee on the Rights of the Child by 15 children from all over the world, including the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg. And these children were arguing that 5 countries in particular had violated their rights to life and health under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And interestingly, these 5 countries that were the target of this case were Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. And you might wonder, well, why didn't these children bring cases against the United States and Russia and China and the other really large emitters of greenhouse gases? And the answer to that question is that those large emitters have not ratified the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So you cannot bring cases against those countries. Unfortunately, the Committee on the Rights of the Child dismissed this case because the children had not pursued their case in the domestic court systems. And that's an important point, that in some of these international proceedings require you to exhaust your domestic options before you go to the international system. That's the case with the European Court of Human Rights as well. So now let me shift gears and talk about the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is the UN agency that's really fundamentally in charge of overseeing the human rights functions of the United Nations. There are 47 member states that are elected to serve on the Human Rights Council for a period of 3 years. Turkey is not currently a member of the Human Rights Council, so countries that are not members of the Human Rights Council still participate, but do not have a vote on resolutions. And it's the Human Rights Council that's responsible for appointing people like me, special rapporteurs. And also, the final thing I want to mention about the Human Rights Council is that they oversee something called the Universal Periodic Review process. And this is another really important opportunity for civil society to put pressure on governments to improve their human rights records. Every country in the world goes through the Universal Periodic Review process on a rolling 5-year basis. So we're just complete. The Human Rights Council prepares a report on each country. All other countries have input into that report, and civil society also has input into that. So it's a really great way to have the Human Rights Council adopt recommendations from civil society as to what a country should do to improve its human rights record. And the fourth round, this is a process that started back in 2006. The fourth round is just kicking off later this year, the fourth round of the Universal Periodic Review process. And I think this is a really important time to begin elevating the profile of climate change and environmental problems and their impacts on human rights in this Universal Periodic Review process. I was just talking to a diplomat from Fiji yesterday, and Fiji, who is a member of the Human Rights Council, Fiji is going to ask every country that's going through the Universal Periodic Review process how they're addressing the climate crisis and how they're implementing the right to a healthy environment. So this is a really important opportunity, as I said, for civil society to have input at these various aspects of the process. There's also the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the agency that really provides technical expertise on the ground in countries around the world. So they'll have country offices assisting governments in fulfilling their obligations. And currently the High Commissioner is a wonderful woman from Chile, Michelle Bachelet. Now, most of my time today, I want to talk about the special procedures, and this is where I'm involved. As I said, these are appointed by the Human Rights Council. There are currently about 50 special rapporteurs working on thematic mandates and also a number of country-specific mandates. And I want to be really clear that we are appointed as independent experts. So there's a nomination process, and also want to emphasize that we serve in a volunteer capacity. So none of us are paid for doing this work. And it's an incredible honor and a privilege to do it. It's also a huge challenge, I can tell you. There's, as I said, close to 50 special rapporteurs working on issues such as poverty, the right to food, the rights to water and sanitation, toxics and human rights. Just last October, the Council decided to appoint a new special rapporteur specifically on climate change and human rights. And that new special rapporteur will be appointed in the coming session in March of this year. The environmental mandate at the Human Rights Council was created in 2012, and the first mandate holder was Professor John Knox from the United States, with a goal of studying the human rights obligations related to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and to promote good practices relating to the use of human rights in environmental policymaking. And I have to say that when John Knox took this role on in 2012, there was still a lot of misunderstanding about how important environmental issues are in the field of human rights. And John did an absolutely terrific job, produced a series of very comprehensive reports, and really, I think, made it clear that all human rights depend on a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Whether you're talking about the right to life, the right to health, the right to food, the right to water, all of these rights are directly connected to the health of the planet, which we are so fortunate to live on, this beautiful blue-green earth of ours. John also did reports on climate change and human rights, biodiversity and climate rights, carried out a series of country visits. And the last report this is John, the last report he presented to the Human Rights Council was on framework principles on human rights and the environment. And this was a really important report because it sets out what states must do to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights from the various environmental threats faced by society. I was appointed in 2018 as John's successor. You can only serve for a maximum of 6 years as special rapporteur. That's probably long enough for any volunteer to take on this task. And I was just reappointed for my second 3-year term. Adam's already introduced me, so I won't talk about that. Really, the work that I do as special rapporteur has 4 main components. One is called thematic reports. A second is country visits. Third are communications. And fourth are amicus curiae briefs. So I'll talk about each of these, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So I prepare a report every year to the Human Rights Council and another report to the General Assembly on different topics. And this is the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the General Assembly in New York. And the topics that I've covered in recent reports are clean air, safe and sufficient water, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, healthy and sustainably produced food, and most recently, a report on non-toxic environments. And these are really critical elements of the right to a healthy environment. I also produced a report for the Human Rights Council that identified over 500 good practices from around the world in recognizing and implementing the right to a healthy environment. So for example, in Turkey, it's good news that the right to a healthy environment is recognized in the Constitution of Turkey. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done in taking those words on paper and translating them into actions to protect the environment. My next report to the General Assembly will be on the planetary environmental emergency and the Sustainable Development Goals. And then following that, I'll do reports on business and gender and human rights and the environment. Special rapporteurs are also allowed to do 2 formal country visits every year. And so, we try and balance get some regional balance. And then you spend 1 to 2 weeks in the country, very intensive time meeting with as many people as possible to talk about the human rights challenges related to environmental protection in those countries. And then you produce a report, which is eventually presented to the Human Rights Council. In my first country visit, I went to Fiji. And of course, Fiji is a small island developing state that's really being heavily impacted by the climate crisis. My second visit was to Norway to visit a country that's one of the causes of the climate crisis, continuing to produce huge volumes of oil and gas. And then most recently, I went to another small island developing state, St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And I have to tell you, it's really quite impactful to visit these countries and to see people who are experiencing themselves the impacts of the climate emergency. In Fiji, I visited a village that had to be completely relocated from a place where people had lived for thousands of years right beside the ocean. But because of rising sea levels and intense storms and saltwater contamination of their drinking water, that entire community had to be relocated inland about 3 kilometers. And so now they're cut off from the ocean that, there's a trail, but it's very steep and it's very hot. So it's difficult for children and women, elders, persons with disabilities to actually get back to the ocean from their new village site. This year, I'm hoping to visit a combination of countries, including Slovenia, Chile, and Portugal. And I've requested, the way the system works, you have to request permission to do a visit. I've requested permission from India, Namibia, and China for the years ahead. We can also do informal visits to universities, and these, though, we don't really engage with the media, we don't produce reports. Okay, here we're coming to communications, and I know this is a topic of great interest for people in Turkey. There is a communications process that special procedures are tasked with overseeing, and this enables individuals from countries around the world to basically make allegations that their human rights are being violated or are potentially going to be violated by some kind of activities in their country. And so we work with civil society in countries around the world to collect information, to verify that information. And then what we do with that information is we put it into a letter in which we lay out the facts and ask governments or businesses a series of questions to clarify and respond to these allegations. Governments and businesses are given 2 months to respond. And we can do, there's two types of these communications. One are called urgent appeals. And these are for situations that are really time sensitive, where people's lives are endangered, or there's a threat of damage that could be very serious and long lasting, even irreversible. And in these cases, the onus is on governments to respond as quickly as possible. Then we have also what are called allegation letters. And these are basically the same type of thing, but without the same degree of urgency or time sensitiveness. And again, governments have 60 days to reply. Who can submit these types of information to us? Well, alleged victims of the human rights violations or anyone representing those people. And if the communications are being brought by representatives, then we require the informed consent of the victims or their families. So these communications can be brought forward by civil society organizations, by environmental groups, by unions, etc. And they come into the office in Geneva, and the office decides which of the various special procedures, special rapporteurs is best suited to take the lead on any given case. Most of these are sent, most of the letters we prepare go to governments, well, almost all of them, but we also do send some to business actors and also sometimes to intergovernmental organizations like the World Trade Organization. Now there's some, I'm going to be really frank with you. I'm going to be quite clear. There are some advantages of this mechanism and there are some disadvantages. It can be a useful tool in urgent cases. That really depends on the government in the country in question, because some governments, and I'm not going to name names here, but some governments really don't even reply to most of the letters that we write. Other governments are much more responsive. One advantage is that you don't have to exhaust your domestic legal remedies. So unlike some of those other mechanisms like the committees that the UN treaty bodies, you don't have to exhaust your domestic remedies before you bring a communication to the special procedures. And one of the from a civil society perspective, these types of communications can generate quite a lot of media attention. For example, I was involved in a really disturbing case involving some indigenous people in Colombia in South America, whose village is directly beside one of the world's largest open pit coal mines. And so over the course of recent decades, this coal mine has generated an enormous amount of air pollution, water pollution, and yet this indigenous community is continuing to live in extreme poverty. Their water supply has been contaminated, their air quality is terrible, and it's just really a terrible situation. And so I was contacted by representatives of this indigenous community, sent a communication to the government of Colombia, and then because of the urgency of the situation, published a press release. And that press release became really the front page news in Colombia for a series of days. It was the big headline on the newspapers, the first story on the television news. And it was the story was the United Nations expressing concern about the situation in Colombia. So that can be very helpful for civil society. There has to be a special procedure in place covering the issue. So obviously for the environment, there are a number of special procedures that are covering aspects of environmental issues. There's myself. There's also, as I mentioned, a special rapporteur on toxics and human rights. There's a special rapporteur on human rights defenders, which is a serious issue in Turkey. There's a special rapporteur on water and sanitation. There's a special rapporteur on food. And so all of us coordinate our efforts to make sure that we try and respond to as many communications as possible. I think that's another drawback of the system is that, I'm a volunteer. I have 2 people working with me as staff people in Geneva. Just to be honest, again, we get more communications than we have the resources to deal with. So it's a real challenge for us. We try and prioritize the most important, the most urgent communications. And while we do send these letters to the governments and to corporate actors, we don't have a lot of capacity to follow up if they don't respond or if their response is inadequate. That's really something that we're not able to deal with. So I've talked, and so there are cases where these communications actually result in states taking action and stopping the violations or clarifying the situation. And in some cases, as I mentioned, there is media attention that can be used to put pressure on state and to add weight to the allegations that civil society is making. I checked we have a database, and there's a link here so that you can see all of the communications that have been sent to any country on any topic at the link that I've put here, and we can share these slides after the event. But Turkey has been the recipient of 111 communications in the past 12 years, not just on the environment, but on all issues. And so I checked through, and 7 of these issues, 7 of these communications involved either my mandate, the toxics mandate, or the water and sanitation mandate. And on this website, you can actually see the letters that have been sent to the state, and you can also see the response that has been sent by the state to us. So this is a kind of a good resource to get familiar with the system. And I also was in doing some research for this seminar today. Turkey the government has a good record of responding to communication. So that's encouraging. That means that they're taking this seriously. I didn't check the quality of their responses, but at least they are engaging in the system. And the final thing I'll mention in terms of my work, and then I really want to leave lots of time for our conversation, is that I have begun intervening in major lawsuits around the world where environmental degradation is threatening or damaging or harming human rights. I mentioned the case in Australia and the case of the children against a number of countries at the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I've also been involved in air pollution cases in South Africa and Indonesia, an oil spill case in Ecuador, a climate change case in Brazil, an offshore oil and gas case in Norway. And what I do in these cases is I file what are called amicus curiae briefs, or friend of the court briefs. And these are basically making from an independent perspective, putting forward the international human rights law and international environmental law that will help the court come to a hopefully a good outcome in the case. So that's something that potentially down the road, if there's a case in Turkey or involving Turkey, I could potentially become involved as a friend of the court in such a case. And I want to just finish by saying that in October of last year, for the first time, the Human Rights Council recognized this basic human right, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It was a really exciting moment. Civil society around the world had been working on this for many decades. And on Friday, October the 8th, states voted. 43 states at the Human Rights Council voted in favor, none voted against, and just 4 states abstained. So that was really a critical moment. And I think now we have a strong tool to use to pressure governments to do more, to take more ambitious and urgent action to deal with the climate crisis, the decline of biodiversity, and the pervasive pollution that is harming human rights. So Resolution 48/13, that's the name of the resolution. And basically, as I said earlier, this right, what does it mean? What does the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment mean? It means that everyone has the right to enjoy, without discrimination, clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainable food, a safe climate, non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. So I'm going to stop there and open up the floor to questions or comments. And I look forward to hearing from you and engaging in this conversation.
Thank you again for joining us and giving your time to us and being with us, answering all the questions and providing you your wisdom and your expertise and
let me say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. And more importantly, let me say thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing in advocating for human rights and advocating for a safe, clean, and healthy environment. I couldn't do my job without the work that you folks are doing. And so I'm deeply grateful and I appreciate your time, especially on a Friday night. So I'll sign off and we'll be in touch. Take care, everybody.
You too.
Thank you very much, Adam.